Welcome to Black History, Black Futures Podcast 2024 season. This is Episode 1, The Art of Resistance. I'm Hillary McAndrew Plate, Public Programming and Partnerships Manager for the City of Virginia Beach Cultural Affairs Department. And on behalf of the city, we are proud to partner with our friends at Norfolk State University and Princess Anne County Training School Union Kempsville High School alumni and friends to present this series. This series began in 2021 to celebrate and extend Black History Month programming in Virginia Beach and all over, launching Zoom panel presentations and oral history gatherings year-round, because Black history is U.S. history, and it happens every day, all year long. As the series has grown, we are now excited to partner with Norfolk State University Radio Hot 91 and its illustrious director, Mr. Maynard Scales, to shift this series to podcast platform, ensuring that even more students and audiences of all ages can access these valuable and dynamic discussions. Each year, we focus on the annual National Black History theme, so this year we are diving into African Americans in the arts through 3 new podcast episodes engaging Virginia artists and national and international artists based in other major cities. Episodes will be released in June, September, and December, and will be available anytime for download or streaming through Hot 91, NSU, and the City of Virginia Beach Cultural Affairs websites. Without further ado, I am grateful to work with 2 astoundingly intelligent and remarkably kind women who host this program and allow me the great privilege of sitting in with our remarkable guests for these conversations. Dr. Stephanie Richmond is the Associate Professor of History and the Director of the Joseph Jenkins Roberts Center for African Diaspora Studies at Norfolk State University, as well as the Director of the Sold Down River Program. And she is our digital and internet co-host and joining us for this conversation. Thank you, Dr. Richmond. Thank you. Our moderator and host is the renowned author and educator, Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander. Dr. Newby-Alexander is the Endowed Professor of Virginia Black History and Culture, the Director Emeritus of the Joseph Jenkins Roberts Center for African Diaspora Studies, and the Senior Scholar and Co-Founder for the Center of African American Public Policy at Norfolk State University. Her work has resulted in numerous acclaimed publications, such as Virginia Waterways and the Underground Railroad, African American History of the Civil War in Hampton Roads, among others. She has published numerous articles, appeared on national programs for the BBC, C-SPAN, and the History Channel. Her work has garnered awards and significant grants to continue bringing attention to uncovering and preserving Black history in America. Welcome, Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander.
Thank you, Hillary. Well, thank you all for joining us for today's event. And we are looking forward to your participation. Well, African Americans and the arts. That is the theme of African American History Month for 2024. And of course, the theme is to help us to explore the creativity, the resilience, and the innovative culture that has uplifted spirits and soothed souls for over 400 years through music, song, dance, literature, folk tales, art, and a whole host of other things. The expectation is that by exploring this theme, we will help everyone to really understand the fullness and the humanity of Africans who have been here in America. The focus of this particular discussion today is Black resistance. It has been the foundation of the Black arts movement, especially since the beginning of the 20th century. But I would venture to say it has been a part of African American history since the first time that people of African descent stepped onto the continent of what we call North America today. This movement has helped to define and refine the Black aesthetic. And it's been a reflection of people's yearning for freedom, independence, liberty, and especially freedom from oppression. In fact, when you look at Black resistance, it is African Americans who've been defining and redefining themselves because the history of America has sought to marginalize Blacks make them into stereotypes, and justify its treatment of Africans in America. So the Black arts culture movement, we call Black resistance, has been led by a number of activists. And as I said, it was really defined very well by the 1960s by a whole host of artists. Many of them have been associated with the Black Power movement. It's this belief in self-determination, Black culture, those things that we have actually understood that were well defined by the New Negro movement in the early part of the 20th century. But even before then, you would see Africans in America in the years following the American Revolution who were doing the same thing. They were defining and redefining themselves. That was the first time the term Afro-American was used in American society, and that was in the years following the American Revolution. The Black experience in America has generally been defined by discriminatory treatment, both through government, by individuals, as well as the social structures that were created. And in so many ways, though, African Americans have sought to flip that script, so to speak. They've sought to change the way that people of African descent are perceived, whether it's their bodies, their hair, the way that they move, the way that they think, the life experiences, so that what they're doing in their art of resistance is to preserve history, to preserve community memory, and of course as a way of empowerment, both community empowerment and self-empowerment. And so there are a number of cultural movements like the New Negro, Black arts, Black Renaissance, what we call the Harlem Renaissance period, hip-hop, Afrofuturism. All of these were led and defined by people of African descent. And of course, here are some definitions of those areas. So the New Negro, this was the first time that collectively you would see African Americans through the arts begin to advocate for themselves and help to redefine who they were, especially because of the onslaught of stereotypes that came out to justify Jim Crow and segregation in America. We would see this period of Black arts, Black Renaissance, known as the Harlem Renaissance, but it was much bigger and much broader than that limited time frame. And it influenced the literary, the artistic, the musical, the theatrical that was going on, and African Americans were helping to push that envelope in the post-World War I years and take ownership of how they were to be represented, especially because in the post-World War I period, you would see a resurgence of discrimination, a resurgence of violence against African Americans. This is, of course, the period when you would see Tulsa, Oklahoma's massive massacre of African Americans in the Greenwood section. This is the same time period you would see President Woodrow Wilson declare that all federal offices would be segregated, which meant that essentially many African Americans would lose their jobs or opportunities in the federal government. He would even go so far as to segregate the meeting spaces and the cafeteria throughout the federal government. This is the time period, of course, even as we get into the 1930s, when Franklin Roosevelt would come into office and initiate the New Deal. This is the time period when we would see the beginnings of additional structural, segregated, discriminatory acts, including the Homeowners Association that would redline African American communities. Eventually, we would see the destruction, especially of the Black business districts, and yet African Americans were writing about this, were identifying it. You would see in Aaron Douglas's works, for example, so much of that expression. Then, of course, the hip-hop period. Though people identify it primarily in music, this is the genre that has helped to define not only music, but fashion, language, spoken word, the arts in general. And then, of course, Afrofuturism, which helps to redefine our future, since so many science fiction books, as well as films, television shows, completely erased African Americans from existence. And so Afrofuturism is bringing that back. And it is then my pleasure to introduce two of our panelists today who are incredible artists. And I'd like to begin by introducing Brittney Harris, who's an internationally recognized assistant professor of theater at Old Dominion University with almost, or actually over a decade of experience in applied theater, focusing on race and performance, performance as activism, and community-engaged theater. Her research focuses on the vicarious trauma that comes from social media on a personal psyche and how narrative-based storytelling can enable social resilience and redemption. As an artist and educator, she provides this sacred space for discovery, exploration, and individuality. In 2020, she wrote and directed the play Echoes, Transcending Through Story, that combined her love of theater with social responsibility. And she centers women's experiences in this particular play by amplifying their voices, spotlighting social injustices, racial inequality, and patriarchal dominance. She has toured around with solo performances that include the Intersection, the Sandra Bland project, as well as Being Bad. I'm tripping up with my words here. And finally, she has completed some research, and I'd like to hear more about this one, on Rwanda, working with the youth population. And so we're looking forward to hearing more from her during our discussion. Welcome, Brittney Harris.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Our next panelist is coming to us from New York, and this is Curtis Stewart, who is a 4-time Grammy Award-nominated violinist and composer. I should have asked him to play us something here while we're having a conversation. He translates stories of American self-determination to the concert stage. He tears down the facade of classical violinists. He's always in pursuit of what he calls musical authenticity, treating art as a battery for realizing citizenship. He's presented at Carnegie Hall, Lincoln Center, the Kennedy Center, Cal Performances, Washington Performing Arts, Virginia Arts Festival, the Juilliard School, as well as the 2022 Grammy Awards. He's also made special appearances with the Los Angeles Opera as curator and guest soloist, with Anthony Roth Costanzo and the New York Philharmonic Bandwagon on MTV specials, with a whole host of people. And of course, he was at Madison Square Garden with Stevie Wonder, Bruce Springsteen, and Seal. His 2021 album of Power, Bright Shiny Things, was nominated for a Grammy Award for Best Classical Instrumental Solo in 2021, and then his album, his 2023 album, Love, which is a tribute to his late mother, has been nominated under Best Instrumental Solo in the 2024 Grammy Awards. He's a solo violinist, a composer, artistic director of the American Composers Orchestra, a Juilliard School professor, and a member of award-winning ensembles including Public Quartet and the Mighty Third Rail. Thank you so much for joining us, Curtis Stewart.
Mouthful. That is a mouthful, isn't it?
You guys are busy people.
Yeah, busy.
Well, I would like for us to start with our first question. And I hope that as we're going through, that from time to time you'll comment on some of the images that I pulled out, because these are all images representing Black resistance from artists. So my first question, and I'm going to actually start with Brittney. How has what is identified as Black art, paintings, movies, theater, music, fashion, design, etc., how has Black art been used as a tool for resistance and to fighting oppression?
Yeah, absolutely. What happens when we have the expansion of using multiple mediums to connect with communities, to connect with people, to connect with ourselves, we are necessarily amplifying our narratives beyond what mainstream may put in front of us. Each of us are artists in our own right. So some people may look at canvas and find the medium of painting as their way of expression. For me, it's been particularly the stage and the narratives that I've seen performed on the stage, and realizing that I don't necessarily see myself in those narratives, and creating a space for that. So when we start thinking about Black art in particular, it's this idea of not casting a broad stroke of something, but showing the intricacies that make Black artists and Black individuals who they are. What I love about our entire species is the fact that we will find a way to express ourselves by any means. Creative expression is creative wellness as well. It's healthy for us. It creates dialogue. It creates space. And inevitably, it creates a space for people to view us, and not just engage at us, but with us in dialogue about what is seen. Even this image that I'm looking at right now, just the beautiful complexities of what it looks like to be a BIPOC community, or BIPOC people in general, this idea that we are various shades of experience, various shades of narratives. And so in its essence, resilience and resistance is about taking space, owning space, and having space. And I believe that's how Black art is identified as a tool, as resilience.
Thank you so much. You remind me of how American society not only homogenized people of African descent, but made them invisible all at the same time.
Like, okay.
Which is an extraordinary feat.
Yeah.
Curtis.
I mean, I want to say that these stories are for the other looking onto Blackness. It's obviously a way of empathizing. It's a opportunity to empathize, I would say, because many times I have these conversations all the time with my orchestra, with my quartet. When you display Blackness or Black art on a stage, on a specific stage that doesn't have the donors, doesn't have the community, doesn't have the history of being tapped into Blackness, what exactly are you doing? And it becomes, so I'm constantly asking myself that question. And so it's just displaying that on a stage that has not necessarily represented that historically. It certainly is resistance in a way, but in another way, it's creating our own stages to represent that in the way that feels communal and connected would be a much more, not necessarily impactful, but just, whole representation of what Black art means. And so I'm constantly grappling with, can classical music be Black? I'm constantly grappling with that question. And in the meantime, I think we present music that is as full of life and the culture that we come from as possible. And that is a form of resistance, because at every corner people, like, oh, that isn't what this isn't how we normally do it. Oh, there's all these question marks that poke holes into the culture itself and whether it quote unquote belongs. So just fighting for its existence on the stage is a form of resistance. And it's less about the art itself and more about just the process of getting it to exist and why it exists and where it exists.
So in other words, you're saying pushing that envelope so that people don't tell you where you belong.
Right.
Or where your music belongs, but it's kind of like what Beyonce did with the country music.
Right.
You know, here, but that there's the huge irony there that country music, in part, is African American music. So that notwithstanding, you know, you're going to tell her this isn't your music. So I've appropriated your music, and now I'm going to tell you you don't belong in this genre.
Yeah. Right. Exactly.
And
I mean, right. Well, there's no American classical music. There is no American music at all without Black music.
Absolutely.
In my view, you know. And even the you know, the celebrated, lauded academic, I like to call them academically lauded classical composers like Aaron Copland and Leonard Bernstein and Steve Reich and all these people. Those people don't exist without jazz. They don't exist without the blues. They don't exist without folk music. They don't exist without African music, the repetition of African music.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? And those influences are acknowledged, but somehow the person used to kind of accumulate the influences are quote unquote lauded, and the influences are still left out. And then the other question is why, like I read sometimes I read my own bio and I'm kind of like, it's almost like, why do I have to put those names in that bio to assert that I should be listened to? And I'm constantly,
Yeah, it's interesting about like the credibility part of it. It's so funny that you talk about the history of music is the same thing with theater. This idea of the rituals, I call it the technology of the circle. You go back to the African griot, circling around each other, telling narratives, this verbal storytelling, this way that we communally share information. Somehow we bring those customs, we find these customs, and then it disseminates to, okay, so where did that come from? Where did that originate from? And so what we do is, you know, we try to bring back some of those very visceral, real, ritualistic practices that make the work have a little bit more gravitas. But again, if I start mentioning about certain tribes or certain, you know, groups that did that work, it would not hold the same credibility if I don't mention the big names in theater, the Stanislavskis and the Meisers, which is fine. They're beautiful techniques that we follow, but there are also other practitioners, other practices that inform it that were very much African informed, Afrocentric, that I'm finding myself bringing slowly back into the classroom. And then just to spaces that I work with in the community. So Curtis, I feel you on that.
Yeah, right. I mean, I teach a class that was at one point called cultural equity and performance practice.
Oh yeah.
So that's a lot of words, but
no, I got
what that means is, you know, there's a whole way that we play Mozart. There's like a performance practice of Haydn. They know exactly what type of chin rest. They knew what horse they cut up to make a gut to get the strings. They know all this stuff about that, but they have no idea how to play a blues scale.
Yeah, it's kind of striking. Aoife O'Donovan and Yasmin Williams are in town here in Norfolk in 2 weeks, and I'm really sad because I'm going to be out of town because I'm an amateur fiddler. Nice. But the interesting thing is, like, Aoife O'Donovan has the headliner, and everybody I know is much more excited to go take a master class with Yasmin Williams that afternoon. And so we're like, you know, what is happening? And same thing with, you know, it took Beyonce going into country music for Rhiannon Giddens to become, you know, played in a lot of Black households across America for the first time. And I was like, well, there's all of this history and tradition that isn't being appreciated and conveyed in kind of popular culture and media that informs so much of, you know, country music, rock and roll, blues. But if you go to bluegrass and blues jams anywhere, they're white and old.
Well, you know, it's frustrating to me because folks like Rhiannon Giddens, I was introduced to her probably 10, 15, maybe more than 15 years ago, and became a fan of her work as far back as Carolina Chocolate Drops and then her independent work. And it is, you know, even as a white person, it's frustrating to watch people that you know are exceptionally talented and creating really wonderful work, and also reminding people of the historical work that precedes themselves. I mean, she's taken really old folk tunes and brought them back to life in new ways and influenced so many people in the more traditional music scene, and to watch as they're having to put those names on their bios in order to get the validation from, you know, quote, mainstream America or radio stations, wherever. So it is, I think, a prolific practice of having to have Black artists who are not doing the popular work validate and revalidate themselves.
You know, it seems that during America's culture wars that was started by Richard Nixon, just as a way of galvanizing the white population to vote for the Republican Party, by saying that somehow your culture is about to be erased. And why was there that reaction? Because if you listen to the radio, and I think none of you know what I'm talking about, but in the 1960s and early 70s, you would hear songs like, you know, that song Patches. I immediately thought about it, and that was Clarence Carter's song, very much like a blues country song, and it was so popular. And no one tried to put him in a box. They just played his music. But you would start to see this box making by the time Ronald Reagan came into office, because this was the culmination of the culture wars. And I see the culture wars coming back once again, or has already returned, really. And it is about this fear in American society of white culture being somehow marginalized, when white culture is even an anomaly to say. There's no there's no such thing. It's manufactured, because we have been a blended culture for a very long period of time. But when you appropriate other people's creative works and claim it for yourself, and then try to define it within the context of whiteness, then it becomes something else. And that's what we've seen. We saw with Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly with the dancing. You never heard of the Nichols brothers or the Nicholas brothers.
Yeah.
And you know, these were, to me, the most gifted, the most gifted tap dancers on the planet, who worked hard. There's this concept that, oh, you know, well, Black people are just naturally gifted, so they're dismissed. Their brilliance is dismissed. But, oh, no, Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly, they worked hard to get, you know, so never mind the reality. And so they marginalize these individuals when, in fact, they studied their tap dancing techniques and then appropriated them in the same way that Pat Boone appropriated Tutti Frutti from you know who. Well, you know, it reminds me, and Curtis, you know, I would love to know your feedback on this. Wynton Marsalis, I remember when he came out with his classical album that won all the awards. And I found that as he's gotten older, more experienced, that the jazz that he creates and performs has become so rich and important. It wasn't as much when he did this incredible classical music. So he was actually sending a message. And I was just wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, Wynn is a great example of someone who, I mean, I know everybody has a bad taste in their mouth when they use the word code switching.
Mm-hmm.
But I was brought up to believe that code switching is a superpower. It's something that you can do to you get in there and you break, and then you have to make sure you break it down. It's not like you get in with your language and you speak a certain way, and then you break it down. I think that's what he's been able to do. I mean, for example, he just wrote a violin concerto that people are stomp clapping, people are walking off the stage. There's all these like calls, and it's totally full of the cult of his culture. And if he had written that piece in 19 whatever 89 or whenever he came out with his classical album, I I wonder what would have happened. And it's almost like there's a sense that art isn't legitimate just based on what it is. It's also quote unquote legitimate. Also, I mean, legitimate is a word that we can question, but um, it's based on who makes it, when they've made it, what else they've done. So it's. I mean, and in reaction to this question, I just feel like on classical stages, the primary mode of resistance is just naming influences and naming things as black art. Like we talk about Bartok. He's this Hungarian, Austro-Hungarian. We talk about Beethoven as being an Austrian composer. We talk about but we need to identify the roots of the music, I think, and that would be a massive form of resistance. So, and sorry, just to speak on the other point that someone else mentioned, which is the Beyonce, Rhiannon, and Giddens thing. Because Rhiannon, some would have argued that Rhiannon was pretty pop for her field, and Beyonce picked her up, and suddenly she's up in this pop arena. I mean, the year before she had won a Pulitzer Prize. I mean, that's as high as that's pretty much, and so. It's kind of like, especially in this era, the audience, gets to choose their form of representation and resistance very freely because of streaming and all these internet tools. And so when we talk about using pop music to, again, legitimize or give someone more voice or power, we're really talking about influence. It's not about like
Right.
necessarily worth. It's like, oh, Beyonce's into this thing, so maybe I should check it out. And therefore it has more influence and therefore more quote unquote worth or legitimacy. And so in fact, when we're on these stages and when we're in these places and we don't name our influences, you are negating that source's not power, but just vitality in life. So I think a main form of resistance is just openly naming influence.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to go to the next question and start with you, Curtis, since you're on a roll and this fits right into what you were talking about. So how does your background, knowledge, and experiences influence your work in Black art?
Well, my dad is a jazz musician. He was a trumpet player at first, and then he switched to tuba. And he went to play with Dizzy Gillespie and Sonny Rollins and McCoy Tyner, all this, Charles Mingus. He was like close
Wow.
friends with a lot of these people. And, jazz is a name that was given to this art form that he plays, but that's becoming more and more popular to say now. But, he was, steeped in the realm of jazz. My mom is a violinist, and she of European descent. She's Greek ethnicity, but born in Poland. Her mom was an opera singer in Poland. But she was she was constantly trying to find the Greek blues. Actually, that's something that she would constantly talk about, like finding ways and connections for her culture to kind of mirror or emulate this other culture. And so I found myself kind of caught in the middle there. I was trained classically, and I wasn't trained in jazz, meaning I didn't go to school for it. I didn't spend the number of hours that I would like to have spent doing it. But I can improvise. I can play changes. I can phrase in a way that sounds like it's coming from a bebop or swing or blues form. So I think um, my background kind of tells me what I need to call myself again, and it's all about self-determination. And I totally identify with that those different waves of Black self-determination. Um, and I mean, people try to call me a jazz violinist, and there's no way I would ever. There's no world I would think it was disrespectful. I'm not good enough to be a jazz violinist in a way. Like I think of it as just. I mean, those are not really the words I'm thinking in my head, but I just think it would be. I don't. I wouldn't be doing honor to those words to be calling myself that in my mind. Um, anyway, I'm not sure if I answered the question, but
No, you did,
that's
because in essence, what you're saying is that Black art, the very essence of it, is self determination and self expression, the refusal to allow someone to put you in a box and to define what's in that box.
I just want to put in there, I think, Curtis, that since I met you, gosh, is it like 17 years ago, 15 years ago? It's a
wow.
long time. It's a
You
long
all,
time.
you all
But
are getting old.
it's
That's all I have to say.
you don't look it though. You look just like I left you in New York City. But I met you when you were doing work with Darian Dushan around Mighty Third Rail. And
Yes.
so it was actually theater that brought Curtis and I together, because
Wow.
I'm not a music person, but I've learned a lot from some incredibly amazing musical folk. And Curtis, I think the thing that has always stood out to me echoes this self-determination. I am going to express myself as a Black artist without being defined by other people. I think you embody that because you can play any music. For me, not being a musician, I don't know how many years someone has to study to be validated or to have the social capital of being, the epitome of classical violinist or the epitome of jazz violinist. I can barely tune my banjo. But as a listener, and as a director, producer, watching you on stage, you emote and feel and embody whatever type of music you're playing, and what you play with Mighty Third Rail defies genre. It doesn't fit a single genre. And to me, your reinterpretations of classical music sound that way as well. So I think to echo Dr. Newby-Alexander, you encapsulate it perfectly. I mean, you've self-determined your worth, your lack of box, and at a lot of the music conferences, and particularly at a couple of Indigenous and equity summits that I've had the privilege of being in, one of the themes that keeps coming up is exactly what Curtis is talking about, is this idea that music doesn't need boxes. It's based on the individual interpreting it. So why is one thing, why is Rhiannon Giddens considered folk when she, maybe slides a little more pop? Or why isn't it just all music? I think John Baptiste has kind of explored that in his last album, World Music Radio, where it's not exactly world music, it's not exactly jazz, it's not, so I think that's just something that has always stood out to me about you, Curtis, is that you've always defied boxes.
And I'm sure that the way that you teach is a reflection of who you are as well.
I hope so. I mean, I'm trying my best. I mean, that takes it takes undoing a lot to not assert the same values that have been put on me. Although my violin teacher at school, Lynn Blakesley at the Eastman School of Music, she tried her best. I could feel her trying her best, actually, and trying to support me in doing one thing. But I was always wondering, it's like, why are you pointing me in this direction when I'm trying to go in all kinds of directions? So it was interesting in that way. I also just to reflect on the boxes. I mean, we do live in a. I know I don't want to come off like a like a radical over here, but like, we live in a capitalist society. A box is a selling mechanism.
Yeah.
And I mean, ooh, I mean,
Yeah.
America attained its greatness through a certain type of selling. and a certain, you know what I mean?
We
And so
talked
I think,
Well, just
about that
because
last time,
that
commodifying.
we are in a box when it comes to consumerism doesn't mean that our mind and our talent has to be. Which, I'm going to take my own segue and
Yeah.
come in about my background and knowledge. And this idea of self-determination also comes down to having the permission and the strength and the ability to tell your own stories. And we are all storytellers in whatever capacity, if we're using whatever genre, whatever medium, we are trying to convey a narrative. And so my background is very much education based. Grew up, born and raised here in Norfolk, Virginia, and went away a little bit to explore just the performance avenues and grad school and all of that. But when you come back to the roots that are here, there's this way that media people try to tell our narratives for us, and we have to speak for ourselves. And so instilling that forward into my students, I tell them that they are their own tools of resistance. Like, you are the only person that should tell your story the way that your story should be told. And I think that our backgrounds, our known histories, our lived experiences inform whatever narratives that we need to tell. We talk about just the different genres of theater. We have our classical and our Greeks. We have our comedies and our classics and all of that. And then we have this beautiful array of these new, beautiful Black playwrights and Lynn Nottage and Dominique Marceau. And then when you think about it, you think about Ntozake Shange, August Wilson, and Lorraine Hansberry from probably the 2000s on back. But coming forward, we have so many influences of those people telling their own stories, these complexities, putting these different narratives on stage so we can have a different dialogue beyond, oh, that's just what that's what the media shows us, or that's what that programming tells us, or whatnot. And so in the classroom with my students, when I'm working with my community, the first thing I ask them about anything is, what do you know about something? What do you want to know, and from what perspective? And it's a method that I'm developing. It's called the umbrella method, this idea of we can create multiple streams of information that can then culminate into one singular kind of piece, story, entity, built together, devised together, but giving everyone the space to amplify who they are. And same with what happened in Rwanda. It's a small segue. Well, English is not their first or second language, it's their third. We took away the need to have to express verbally, and we came with physical. This idea of what is your relationship to certain words. And I'm using these words very intently because when it comes down to experience and knowledge, it's based off your relationship to certain things. And it goes back to giving the space and permission to do so. So this has been very beautiful to see that influence come from my years at Governor School, writing monologues about what I lived through, to now sowing that very seed forward. As I say, taking a baton and passing it to the next generation of artists, this tool of self-expression and not having anyone take your story and you take it for yourself.
You guided an entire cast through doing that very, very well. Right here in Virginia Beach and Norfolk, you had a collection of artists that we worked together at the Z with, and for the hidden history of the banjo, where Brittney helped several artists tell the story of the Black roots of the banjo and bluegrass music. And you incorporated not only Black artists, but some very common perspectives of white traditional sort of Appalachian style playing, and it was really remarkable how to watch how you guided each one of them to be their own representation on stage, regardless of where their perception of bluegrass and banjo came from. And then you helped walk that whole instrument and musical experience theatrically and through poetry back across the Atlantic to Africa. And it generated such an amazing conversation afterwards. So that umbrella method, I think, was really visible.
That was very key
in that
there.
particular, in that particular project. That that umbrella method really works. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
Our next question. So Ron Karinga, who is known, of course, for creating the celebration of Kwanzaa, wrote that black art should have 3 criteria. He said it should be functional, collective, and committed. In other words, black art should serve a purpose larger than the creation of art. What is your perspective on this argument, and especially as it has informed your work?
I have a very simple statement, and it's on everything. You look it up, it's affiliated with me, that I do believe that art can be a mirror to society, and in that mirror, it can be entertaining, but it also can be enlightening. If you are there to experience it, it should definitely have a multiple, or even, a multiple perspective to it. It should not just be like, oh, and then you leave. But there's something that lingers with you that goes beyond just the experience. So it can be entertaining, no doubt about it. That is the thing that keeps us living and smiling, and those things are very, again, that creative wellness. But also, what is lingering after this? Did it make you think? Did it make you do some introspective work? Does it make you want to talk to someone afterwards? Did you consider? So yeah, enlightening as well as entertainment.
Curtis.
Yeah, I agree. I think that my art should be functional, collective, and committed. I have a hard time saying what all black art should be.
Absolutely,
And
sure.
the question of, the should part is kind of funny too. So while I would take that advice and be like, yes, okay, let me figure out how I can make my work that way, because I agree with that energy, and I think art in general should be functional, collective, and committed. Honestly, I personally, that's and if it's something made for commercial use, then that's it is pop art, and so that's just my perspective. I love those 3 words. It begs a lot of questions for me, like functional for who?
Function for who, right?
Collective, collective for whom? And committed, I just wonder what that means.
To what?
What does it mean?
To where?
Right.
What does committed actually mean? So I just, for me, the statement begs a lot of questions. But yes, for me, I also would take those 3 things on. But I don't think that black art should be anything.
Should, right.
Well, I think that Karinga was leaving it that kind of open and wishy-washy to allow people that creative license to go anywhere. But even taking those 3 and talking about it is a fascinating position. In fact, what we've been talking about is an anti-siloed approach, an almost consumerism approach that, American consumerism has commoditized Africans and African Americans to the point that when people talk about taking a trip to Africa, they're talking about a safari.
Yeah.
A hunting trip. As if no people live on the second largest continent on the planet. They're just going to go there and take and do. And it's this mentality also that there's a single space.
Right.
With a single culture.
And a single story and a single outlook and all that. Absolutely.
Yes. And so we're still in the throes of that. Historians have looked at the 20th century and said, the other centuries, at least for the African American experience, were really bad too. But the 20th century helped to really solidify, even in freedom, solidify the worst aspects of racism in America, to the point that it has become so institutionalized that every institution, whether it's institutions in the arts, institutions in education, institutions in government, whatever, they're all following a template, and that template has racism baked into it. And so the challenge is, how do you begin to undo those templates and create new ones that provide you with that openness? And then this really is, I believe, what Ron Karinga is saying. It's kind of like the concept from the 20s and 30s of race men and race women, that they use their talents, their abilities, their position to make a difference. Yes, you're making money. Yes, you're doing things, but to change society, kind of like in the movie Harriet, the song, to take my people with me.
Yeah.
So I'm not just going to go there, but I'm going to bring people with me so that I would not be the only one.
May I ask a quick
Sure.
question? Because what you just said brings me back to, I think it was 2 seasons ago, when we did Black Health and Wellness, and you began unpacking the systemic racism within the institution of public health.
Mm-hmm.
And in thinking about how Black artists and those who want to be a part of, engage with Black art, how that drives change forward. Do you feel that the arts have perhaps been more swift or effective?
Now it gets back down to these institutions we were talking about, because academically, there are still very much barriers that the arts cannot necessarily break through. Then you have your community, and then you have this big national scale and all of that. Now, I will say with the expansion of technology, with our Instagrams and TikToks and all the, the expansion of that, I do think messaging is getting a little larger. You're able to reach a larger audience. You're able to connect in and bring in people that you necessarily were probably not able to access. Mm-hmm. But I will say that for me, when I think about communicating with societies and creating stuff like that, I look at things from everything from a performance perspective, like performance studies. So for instance, I look at the performance of protests, this idea of, okay, we all have a unified message that we're going to say, so that's the literature. We all wearing the same thing, that's the costume. Do we necessarily have the protagonist, the people leading the protest, and now we have an antagonist? Like, I look at it from like the dramatic plot structure of things, and I do think if we able to structure some things, I think there's been some barriers that have been broken down. But I will say, just from being in academia, I've done something called devised theater. So what I do is I take a certain topic and I use the student population to build a show from scratch and collaborate with them and all of that. And that's been nice to have certain dialogues. But even in those spaces, I am placed necessarily inside of a box. So I do think there's some growth that has been there. But I do think that there is still much to be done. But I have seen less censorship, for lack of a better word, in the theater, arts, performance, dance, music, etc. Curtis, what is your call on that? Have you seen any shifts in that or anything with that?
Sorry, I was starting to read this next question. I was like,
Okay.
I got to prepare myself. The original question that you're asking me is can you just repeat?
Oh, sure. We did some other series that focused on systemic racism in things like public health and other industries. And so when Dr. Newby-Alexander was talking about, serving this functional collective committed to something greater than, committed to change, do you feel that as a Black artist, there's more progress being made within the arts industry? Is there more hope to be found in the arts industry over, say, public health or government or academia? Or do you feel everything's still pretty about even?
I see. Well, I would have to, being a classical musician, I've self-marginalized myself, and I don't know that much about all those other fields to be able to speak knowledgeably about it. I think if we're just talking about classical art and academia, that's something I could speak to. Mm-hmm. I think they're both academia. There's different levels that are more or less available to change. I think generally, in my experience, staff and administration is very available to change, because all that means is changing around some numbers,
right,
and changing around faculty wants to do what they know how to do. So if they don't know how to play that blues scale or to teach this, they're not going to do it because they want to be, especially at a place like that where you're supposed to be the expert. You don't want to be not the expert.
Mm-hmm.
And then students, I think, are just kind of emotionally just trying to do whatever they think will get them a career, whatever they think their teachers value, whatever they, saw on Instagram that day. So I think that's like this kind of like chaotic. I have no clue. But in the arts, in general, I think there's kind of this like rubber band effect happening. 2020 happened. Everybody got everybody started feeling guilty, and so things changed very rapidly. And then now there's the rubber band effect.
Ricochet.
So what I find is that I have to find. You can't just speak on the thing and have people be interested in it. You have to. I find that I have to be a salesman for my own art, which is kind of, which is interesting. That I have to put that's the only reason for me to put myself in a box is for that, to have that impact.
And so that actually nicely leads us to the next question, which, Curtis, you've already been looking at and thinking, ooh, this is an interesting one. So for those of you listening, the next question is, Black art has been criticized as misogynistic, anti-Semitic, homophobic, and racially exclusive. What are your thoughts about these accusations, and what is the reality?
Well, I think it depends on what type of Black art we're talking about.
Absolutely.
First of all, there's, different forms of Black art have more or less of any one of those things, if at all. I think I also love Brittney's point that art, it truly is a mirror. I mean, there's that quote that, if you, I'm spacing out on the right. Oh, James Baldwin, if you truly love me, you will be my mirror. And so it's really about honesty and expression and creating characters and the world around you and the things you heard. And, I mean, I would say every art has all those things in it. So in my mind, what's the difference between Black art and any other art? There's misogyny in Wagner's operas. There's and certainly anti-Semitism in Tchaikovsky's ballets. There's tons of homophobia in all like any war movie before 18. There's tons of homophobia in those. I just watched An Officer and a Gentleman, and there's tons of homophobic comments. I mean, so what are we talking about?
Right.
And Shakespeare's pretty misogynistic too. So
Yeah.
And anti-Semitic.
Anti-Semitic. Oh my goodness.
So I would just say, okay, these are observations. I would call them less accusations and just say they're observations, and that, we can take the next step of do we remove them? Do we value some things over others? We can talk about that, but anyway, that's my first thought.
Just to add to that, these their responses to their lived experiences, right? And so this idea of Black art being anything different than what regular art in general, just whatever you want to call regular art to be, represents is right in there. There are going to be depictions of several things, which for me, I believe, create dialogue, right? So sometimes things can just be provocative for provocative sake. But if we're creating this to create a dialogue, for us to have some sort of discourse about what's happening, I do think it serves a purpose. There's a reason why, in our dramatic plot structure, we write our villains, we write our protagonists and our antagonists. We have to have these dialogues. Is meant for that. Kind of goes back to my being enlightened by something rather than just being entertained. And that is the reality. Life is both good and bad. Hard, you know what I mean? Like good and evil, like all of that. So there is like this dichotomy that our Black art must serve that and must show that. And understanding that to create the art doesn't mean that you represent that art. Representation may show something, but it does not mean that that is what that artist stands for. I sometimes find myself in unique spaces when I need to direct for a season and realizing what narratives I put on my students, not necessarily the roles that they play, but the narratives, right? And so we got to direct Dominique Morisseau's Blood at the Root, which was in response to Jenna Six, very beautiful piece, very startling piece. But this idea is for the rest of the season, they were considering another piece by Anna Devere Smith called Twilight 92, which is about the race riots in LA. I was like, well, we can't do that. They just did Blood at the Root. Can we give them, and just give them a space to understand that that there's a process, a mental process that goes into building character, all that kind of good stuff, right? So the reality is, how do we hold space for this? How do we represent space for this? And then realizing that in all forms of art, there's going to be both sides of the coin, for lack of a better word. But I think Black art is just like all art experience will have all those complexities in it.
And so, in essence, these criticisms are still trying to put Black art in a box.
Yeah.
And then
Right,
trying
that's
to
exactly what I was
dismiss.
thinking.
Yes. And
Right.
then trying to dismiss it because it has these elements that are seen as negative.
While the other arts are not are
Right.
touted yet again.
Well, Well, and they're negating the fact that perhaps they were created to cause a conversation. Flying West is a good example. I don't think that the playwright or the director or the actor portraying the husband are wife beaters, but they certainly talk about beating your wife in that play. The people in it may or may not be attempting to pass for white, but that's a topic in that play, and you cannot watch that play. You cannot, as I was, be the special effects makeup person on that play and not ask the question, how is this reflective of culture in general? If this is happening in the play, then it's happening somewhere in real life, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's exclusive to the Black experience or to those Black artists that created it. And that those criticisms absolutely just negate the fact that someone may have been intending to have an intelligent discussion with their audience about the piece, which is...
Isn't the purpose of art to make you feel something? And
Yeah.
lots of feelings are negative, right? And sometimes those are the ones in our society we need to grapple with the most, right? We talk, there's a lot of discussion about how it is important to put Black joy out there, but it's also important to put all the feelings out there, because if we don't deal with them, right, we won't ever move forward.
And those feelings sometimes can be challenging for other people to grapple with. But at the same time, what it does is it forces the conversation of recognizing me as a person first and foremost. And that's the struggle. This whole thing of Black resistance is about claiming your humanity by saying that there's a space for me.
Yes.
And that space is not in a box. It's not limited to what you expect, but it ranges in so many ways.
This isn't Black theater. This is Brittney Harris theater. This isn't Black classical music. This is Curtis Stewart music.
Yes.
There's a unique feel and flavor to the pieces that have come out of your individual experience and interests. That's remarkably beautiful.
And I think it can be both and,
Yes,
right? So
yes.
I think it can hold space for both. Like, yes, this is Black theater and Brittney Harris theater. What I mean? I think there's a space for the and in that too. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it is much like in my field. I'm in history, but specifically in African American history. And I tell people, when I'm talking about Black history, I'm talking about American history. And I'm focusing sometimes on Black people, but most times on American society. Because it's those spaces where questions, where storylines, where explanations are left out because they don't fit the narrative of American history that talks about our perfect being. And it will offend people. And that then goes to, I'm going to target both of you kind of individually first, although you
Sure.
can chime in. So, Brittney, this question is to you.
Yeah.
Describe your experiences in theater. Has the theater world become more inviting to Black artists?
I think we've just started creating more spaces for ourselves, and realizing that we are living stages. So this idea of wherever I enter, my race enters with me was one of my favorite quotes, but also this idea of my found space can be a space to amplify myself. What's been very beautiful is the influx of these very beautiful, complex narratives from Black playwrights over the years, from Katori Hall with The Mountaintop, to, like I said, Lynn Nottage, Pearl Cleage. What I love is that we are going to the mainstream, or when I mean mainstream with theater, I'm talking about Broadway and all of that, placing out narratives that are not just putting us in roles that see us as subservient or, lower than or less than, but also these very strong, complex, rooted individuals. So when there aren't spaces for that, this is where I kind of live with my solo work. I tour to something called fringe festivals. So there's something called our independent film festivals, so Cannes and Sundance. But on the theater side, we have fringe festivals, and pretty much each state has one or two. We have one here in Virginia called the Z Fringe, which I happen to be a co-producer for. It's very beautiful work. But it's a place to amplify provocative, avant-garde, experimental work, and narratives that are not typically seen in the mainstream. And what's really nice is that Black artists or any BIPOC artist can come in and share what they want to share. And it doesn't have to be perfectly put in a little bow. It doesn't have to have a beautiful narrative and all of that. But it's a space for us to be what we need to be. And so my experiences with theater leading up to this have not always been as open. I was very much placed in roles of how I look, how I sound. And before the 2000s, there were very few. The narratives that were out there were nice. I mean, I love everything from August Wilson and all of that. These beautiful narratives from the Pittsburgh cycle. But then we get into some other raw narratives that are nice. And so with that, I got into grad school, and I remember the first role that was kind of out of type and cast. I got cast as Jane Eyre in one of the years. And I remember, this is a very true story, I don't want to use the word attacked, but I was chastised because my British accent did not sound British enough. The way my mouth was held did not look like someone that it was nuts. It was crazy. And this idea of that my body didn't fit into a certain narrative of what they thought Jane Eyre would look like. But what was very beautiful is the complex narrative of Jane Eyre, this woman being trapped away in her own personal attic, very much like how Black women feel that they cannot be expressed. So I found, some really good rooted work with that. Accent came through, was fine. But the idea of creating spaces for when I did not necessarily see myself in, but I showed up in. So just to kind of tie it off, I will say that it's a lot more inviting to the narratives. I'm not sure if Black artists are like, yeah, we're more invited, but the narratives that we bring, our lived experiences, are not just made for lack of a better word, a Jezebel, a sex symbol, or whatever. No, we are just normal people that go through real life experiences with our families, complexities that does not involve having to bring in any of those horrible stereotypes. But if we do, let's talk about how we dismantle them. Let's talk about creating dialogue about breaking those and some of those tropes we don't need to carry with us anymore. So yeah, I think it's become more inviting to amplify certain stories and spaces, but there's still a lot of work to be done for sure.
We've come a long way, but we have a lot longer way to go.
Oh yeah.
So I'm going to hand this next question off to you, Curtis. Similar question. Describe your experiences in music. Has the music world become more open to Black artists in areas that were historically not open to them?
I think, there's a few areas that are probably more open. There's other areas that are actively seeking out black artists. There's other areas that are seeking out people, but then don't really want them for what they're bringing, but other than the way they look. So there's, it goes a lot of directions. I've had people, yeah, I've had experiences where, you're welcomed, you want to bring something that is your whole musical self, and they're just like, yeah, let's go. That's definitely happening more. I mean, I've been asked to be a soloist with these various orchestras and do work with these organizations in that sense. So for me personally, I would say yes, it's become more open to me. But in general, if you just look at the percentage of orchestras, black people in orchestras is still very low. Um, uh, so I think there are orchestras actively looking for black artists and musicians. There's definitely groups looking for black composers. That seems like the world of composition is is progressing much faster, especially in the world of chamber music, where these small groups can just kind of flip. There's not a massive institution that is weighing them down. So it's complicated. I think we're just continuing that conversation. And once more black artists are inside of these larger organizations, we have to have conversations about what is valued, in terms of narrative. Like, as narrative in music is kind of funny. It's like a funny thing. It's also about who is making it, and it's about what type of music they're bringing to what the energy and the obvious stylistic influences. I know a lot of black composers who don't want to write quote unquote black music. They don't want to write music that sounds black, quote unquote, whatever that means to people. So there's all these conversations that are happening in these, especially larger spaces, even with the few that are beginning to drip in. So I think the word yes, I would say in general, openness is there, but we haven't quite. It's not full. meaning like the door is maybe not as locked, is unlocked from 9 to 5, but we're still trying to figure out how to,
Right. Well,
we're still trying to get people in.
I think you also don't necessarily have the public transit system to boost people through the door either, too. And maybe boost is not the word that I want. I think that I'm curious what your perspective on the cultivation of younger generations of black artists are, whether that's theater or music, because certainly those subjects are often threatened within the public school arena. And if you're not telling that 7-year-old who just is always humming a tune that there's a place for him as a composer, or that kid that's fiddling with the recorder but maybe doesn't know the channel or the way to get to a conservatory. Certainly there are kids here that are very talented, but it's not necessarily the support mechanisms that are available to them are not like, here, this is how you get into GSA, and then and in order to get to Juilliard, you need to go to GSA to do this. And what about the kid that doesn't get into GSA? How can a brilliant violinist from Green Run High School end up at Manhattan School of Music or Juilliard, or it's not just the adage of practice, 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 right? There's so much more to it that you have to position yourself for. And if our orchestras and our theater companies and the boards of those organizations are not actively finding ways to reach those folks in their formation process, isn't that also problematic? I mean, that's the systemic piece of it, right?
I mean, that's huge. I think, yes, I think that is huge, but it's such a massive undertaking. It's bigger than any one organization can provide, in a way. I mean, first of all, once people get into orchestras, they're like, I don't want to be here. That's one. So the culture in the thing is like, nah. And then the second thing is, it's like the whole world is like, for example, if both of my parents weren't musicians, I don't think I would have. I had a lot of pressures. People was like, "Oh, you should study math. You should study science. You should study these things that you're good at, and you'll make money doing. You'll have a comfortable life." Just minus the racism, they're saying just on a life level, it would be better to do these other things. And so that's just a wholesome version of that, and then there's all the other very insidious things of like, can you do it? Are you allowed, do you have the
it
natural
feels like
talent to do this thing?
accessibility is shifted. Like a big field trip when I was in high school was going to see a piece of theater or going to a show and stuff like that. And so for me, when I start thinking about how to think about Sankofa, this idea to go forward, you have to go back. I think about starting back at my roots here. My old high school, I went to Booker T. Washington High School. And it's nothing for me as a professor, as a person, to go back and just go talk to the students there, to let them know what a path could look like. Now, did I foresee myself ever being a professor? No, but I did know that I love teaching about this. I love talking about the benefit and sharing what this made me feel. Like this tool, you got to get this tool of theater. Passing that along to someone, that was so important to me. So I think it has to start with the individual, because as you said, it is a massive undertaking, as Curtis said, trying to think about how do we grab everyone. But if we can reach back into the communities that we do know. I do a lot of work with Teens with a Purpose, with Deirdre Love. So pouring back into that community, then I know that's going to be amplified. I know that that little pebble is going to be rippling out. They're going to tell someone who's going to tell someone who's going to tell someone. Trusting the fact that we have a ripple effect is a start for me. And it is also, like I said, going back into the spaces that you were welcome to. So I go back to Governor School because I went there. I go back to Booker T. I go back to, like I said, Teens with a Purpose. And then I start looking at other organizations. I start looking at other spaces that I'm like, who's working with them? And it's one of those things that takes work. It takes a little extra time, but I also knew that someone took the time to do that for me. So it's like a humanity thing.
Individuals need to have some intentionality, that if you want to see a future filled with many more Black faces in whatever your medium is, you need to be intentional about reaching them.
100%.
So Curtis, do you have anything to add? Because we are almost out of time.
Well, we're going to just give you a couple of minutes to answer this last question that I have. What is the response from audiences about your work? And what are your next projects? So Brittney, I'm sorry, Curtis, you go ahead. Start.
Sorry, y'all.
No, it's fine.
Yeah, I have had at first mixed, and then also people are very resounding with the music. So I had an album, the 2021 album of Power, that had electronics on it, it had beats on it, it had the music of Childish Gambino on it, it had like my versions, my arrangements and my compositions based on those works. It was nominated for that classical solo Grammy, which is coveted. I mean, like Rachmaninoff was like, people like history. My idols have been nominated for that award. And there was a massive pushback. The Grammy voting period had ended, and the day after the voting period ended, there were articles that came out that were like the Grammys are putting non-classical music into the classical Grammys. So I was lumped in there with John Baptiste for
Yep.
Anyway, and it ran in the New York Times, the Guardian, the Al Jazeera, the whatever. And so I've had that type of pushback, but honestly, those people messed up because they brought me there's things that have happened in a positive way for me due to that, where people probably wouldn't have paid any attention to my music, and those people are resoundingly behind it, and they will fight. It's like I've got these armed forces behind me that are really pushing and helping me out to move forward musically. So I think it goes both ways. I think there are people who are still out there that are like anti, which is fine. And I just think back to my mom and my dad, and I watched them do very experimental non-mainstream type of music. I watched them struggle and hustle and make it happen and determine themselves, put the PR thing together on their own, pay for this. They never got paid to get commissioned to write a piece of music, and then now I'm experiencing the opposite of that. And so I think back to them, and at least I know where my resistance is. With them, they had to just fight in a kind of like invisible battle. So I think it goes both ways for me.
Brittney.
Yeah, the main response that I get from audiences is that they're curious. They're curious about this process. They're curious about the work that I do. I mentioned about it being devised, so that means building something from scratch. So usually we come in with a central theme or idea or a topic that then expands over maybe 6 to 8 weeks. But we came in with nothing, essentially. And so the audience is very curious about that process, curious about the involvement of my students or whoever I'm working with, and then also the creative process with my design team. The projects, my pieces leave them asking questions. I love that when the show is over, the lobby doesn't just clear out, that they're out there talking with each other, wondering, and I try to make experiences immersive. So when you come into the theater, just itself, through the doors, the lobby brings you into the narrative. So for instance, for Blood at the Root, we had a tree hanging in the lobby, and people could take a leaf and put it into a certain pile of their lived experiences as a child. It was very nice just to see where the audience's heart was on certain issues and certain topics, just to kind of gauge where they were. But this idea that they're not just an audience member, that they are spect-actors is a term that Augusto Boal uses. This idea that you're not just spectating and watching, but you're involved in the process. You're just as intricate to the performance as the performers themselves. So they're curious about what I do. And then what's up next is that I'm working on this amazing project with James Madison University for newcomers, or that's what the term they use, or immigrant students in the population of Harrisonburg, and this idea of using theater as a tool for community engagement and conversation as it comes to the job market and working for equity and inclusion in their jobs up there. So how do we use theater to help them better communicate and better express themselves? So I can't wait to jump on that project.
That's cool.
Yeah.
We didn't hear, Curtis, you've got a fantastic project that you've been giving us glimpses of online. Are you able to talk a little bit about that? Or is there another next project that you want to
Sure, I'm constantly making all kinds of next projects. One is called the American Caprices. So there's a whole history of violin caprices, from Paganini to Wieniawski to, these people that challenge the techniques of the violin. And so I'm writing these 24 American Caprices based on recorded American music. So I've done one of like Stevie Wonder and like using Isn't She Lovely? And these are just like fantasies on the themes of these musics. Queen Latifah, UNITY, Joni Mitchell, Big Yellow Taxi, things like that. And so I'm turning those into these caprices that hopefully could be studied in schools and could and push violin technique to this recorded music that there is a reference for, so that people can jump into the quote unquote performance practice of those musics to affect the way they play, so they're not just making Queen Latifah sound like Brahms. That would be hard. That would be the worst case scenario. So that's one. And then the other project is Seasons of Change, which it's a recomposition of Vivaldi's Four Seasons, and it deals with climate change. And I just did this in Phoenix with the Phoenix Symphony. I went into the unhoused community, unhoused shelter. We talked about how climate change affects them on a day-to-day level. I record those conversations, and those conversations get triggered during the performance of the Vivaldi's Four Seasons. So for me, the only reason for the name Vivaldi to be in there, that's kind of what I'm interested in terms of using references. The only reason for Vivaldi to be in there is to get those butts in those seats. Mm-hmm. And then they get to hear these voices that have been marginalized by our society. Mm-hmm. And so those people actually came to the concert. They stood up, they felt proud, they were yelling out like my name from the audience. They were like, and I saw them backstage, and they were like, "Oh, I'm your this was the best day of my life. They were so just they had that feeling. And so those are two big projects that I'm working on. Sorry,
Lovely.
long-winded.
Awesome.
Well, this has been truly exciting. This is an absolutely wonderful way for us to start this whole podcast series for the Black History Month theme on the arts for 2024. I want to thank our guests, Brittney Harris and Curtis Stewart, for being such amazing, amazing panelists. Thank you so much. Stephanie, excuse me, thank you so much. And Hillary for coming in and providing some additional questions and perspectives. And so now I am going to hand it off to Hillary to close.
Well, thank you, Dr. Newby-Alexander. On behalf of the city of Virginia Beach, thank you all for being part of this. Thank you for allowing me to share in the experience. I, as always, learn so much sitting in these rooms, and I'm excited to see the work that's coming from both of these artists. I've been fans for a while, and Virginia Beach is very happy to have had you on. The next podcast will be The Art of Presence, which will be coming up in September. This one is released in June. After the Art of Presence, we will have the Art of Afrofuturism. I want to thank Norfolk State University and Princess Anne County Training School, Union Kempsville High School alumni and friends for helping to support and make these podcasts possible. And certainly, I want to give a huge thank you to Mr. Maynard Scales and Hot 91 for being our recording and production partner for these podcasts. We're very excited to get these conversations in the hands of students and audiences everywhere. Thank you, and until next time.